The air was heavy that October night, thick with a tension I couldn't quite name. Amalia sat across from me at the dining table, swirling a glass of wine absently while I tried to focus on a stack of client proposals. It was her voice, light and casual, that broke the silence. "James called earlier," she said, not looking up. Her tone was too neutral, her phrasing too deliberate. "He wanted to see if you're free this weekend." James. My best friend. My brother in everything but blood. We'd been through hell and back together, college, breakups, business ventures. But something about the way she said his name sent a chill down my spine. There was a softness there, a warmth that didn't belong. I shook it off, dismissing the thought as paranoia. Amalia had been stressed at work, that was all. And James, well, James was James. Loyal to a fault. He'd never betray me. Would he? The following weekend, James and I met at a bar to watch the game. "Amalia thought you could use a night out," he said, grinning. That alone should have been a red flag. Amalia rarely encouraged my time with James, calling it an excuse to relive your college stupidity. When I arrived, James was already there, laughing with the bartender. He waved me over, his smile too wide, too practiced. "You're late," he teased, handing me a beer. "She almost called to check on you." The words were innocent enough, but they struck me like a slap. Since when did Amalia check on me during nights out? James filled the night with chatter, but it was the way he avoided eye contact that stood out most. Something was different. Something was wrong. When I got home, Amalia was already asleep. She looked peaceful, her lips slightly parted as she breathed in the stillness of the room. But peace was the last thing I felt. It was a Wednesday night when the pieces started falling into place. Amalia announced she'd be working late. "Team project," she said, brushing off my offer to pick her up afterward. "Don't wait up." But something didn't sit right. She'd been working late a lot recently. Too much. Around midnight, I decided to drive by her office. Her car wasn't there. Panic clawed at my chest, but I forced myself to stay rational. Maybe she carpooled with a colleague? Maybe. Then I saw it. James's car. Parked discreetly behind a coffee shop a few blocks away. My heart thundered in my chest as I sat there, staring at the sleek black vehicle I'd helped him pick out. 1,000 scenarios raced through my mind, none of them good. When she finally came home, I was waiting in the living room, my face a mask of calm. "How was work?" I asked, my voice deceptively light. She froze for half a second before answering. "Exhausting." She avoided my gaze as she headed upstairs. The lies tasted bitter in the air between us. The truth came a week later, delivered by the cruel hand of fate, or perhaps by my own growing suspicion. Amalia had left her phone on the kitchen counter while she showered. It buzzed with a message. Normally, I wouldn't have looked. But that night, something compelled me. "Last night was incredible. Can't wait to see you again. Love, Jay." Love. The room spun as I scrolled through the messages. There they were, my wife and my best friend, weaving a tapestry of deceit. Code words. Rendezvous locations. Promises whispered in the dark. One message cut deeper than the rest. "He suspects nothing. We just need to play it cool." My hands shook as I put the phone back where I'd found it. My world was unraveling, and the two people I trusted most had the scissors. Confrontation would have been too easy. Too simple. They didn't deserve my rage, not yet. Instead, I began to watch. I tracked their movements, catalogued their interactions. Amalia was careless, leaving breadcrumbs I eagerly followed. James was worse, arrogant in his deceit. I hired a private investigator. What he uncovered confirmed my worst fears: secret meetings at a cabin, long phone calls when I wasn't home, financial transactions I hadn't authorized. They thought they were clever, but they underestimated me. Then came the recording. A hushed conversation in the parking lot of a hotel. "I can't keep lying to him, James," Amalia said, her voice trembling. "What if he finds out?" "He won't," James replied smoothly. "David's too trusting. He'll never see it coming." Trusting. The word seared into my soul like a brand. They weren't just having an affair, they were planning something. Something dangerous. And I was at the center of it. The days that followed felt like a fever dream. I went through the motions of daily life, smiling at clients, nodding through meetings, but beneath the surface, I was unraveling. Every glance Amalia cast my way felt like a dagger. Every word James spoke in casual conversation echoed with hidden meanings. I was trapped in a web of their lies, suffocating. And yet, I couldn't bring myself to confront them, not yet. Instead, I became an observer in my own life. Watching. Listening. Waiting. The private investigator, Johnny Walker, didn't take long to deliver his findings. We met in a secluded corner of a nondescript coffee shop. His demeanor was professional, but his eyes betrayed a hint of pity. He placed a thick envelope on the table between us. "It's all in here," he said quietly, leaning back. "Photos, receipts, transcripts. They've been sloppy." I didn't open it, not there. The weight of the envelope was enough to confirm what I already knew. "There's more," Johnny added, his voice grave. "They've been making plans. Financial ones. It looks like they're moving money around, your money. You might want to freeze those accounts." My stomach churned. Betrayal wasn't enough for them, they were dismantling my life piece by piece. That evening, Amalia came home late again. I was waiting in the kitchen, nursing a glass of whiskey. She breezed in, her hair slightly tousled, her cheeks flushed. "Tough day?" I asked, my tone deliberately neutral. She paused, eyeing me warily. "Yeah. Meetings ran long." I wanted to laugh at the audacity of her lie. Instead, I nodded and stood, moving to pour her a glass of wine. "You're working so hard lately," I said, handing it to her. "I hope it's worth it." She hesitated for a fraction of a second, her smile faltering. "Of course it is. Everything I do is for us." The rage simmered just below the surface, but I forced myself to stay calm. The trap wasn't ready to be sprung, not yet. 2 nights later, the investigator called with an urgent update. "You need to see this," Johnny said. "I'll drop it off tonight." When I opened the package, my blood ran cold. Inside were photos of Amalia and James, not at the cabin this time, but at a storage unit. They were unloading boxes, documents, jewelry, cash. The timestamps showed they'd been there multiple times over the past few weeks. Attached was a map of the unit's location and a set of keys Johnny had borrowed. "What's inside?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Johnny hesitated. "I didn't go that far. Thought you'd want to see for yourself." That weekend, I told Amalia I'd be working late. She barely looked up from her phone, murmuring something about grabbing dinner with friends. As soon as I was sure she was gone, I drove to the storage unit. The key slid into the lock with a sickening ease. Inside, the air was stale, the smell of dust and old paper hanging heavy. The first box I opened was filled with papers, contracts, financial statements. I recognized my name on several of them, forged alongside Amalia's and James's. They'd been siphoning money from our joint accounts into offshore accounts I hadn't known existed. The second box was worse, photos of me. Dozens of them, taken without my knowledge. There were even photos of me sleeping, my face serene in the glow of the bedside lamp. My pulse thundered in my ears as I reached for the final box. Inside was a gun. A small, sleek pistol with its serial number filed off. Next to it was a single, handwritten note. We just need one more thing to fall into place. This wasn't just an affair. This wasn't just theft. This was a plot. I staggered back, my head spinning. Amalia and James weren't just betraying me, they were planning to destroy me. And I still didn't know why. When Amalia came home that night, I was waiting for her. The gun from the storage unit sat on the coffee table, gleaming under the soft light of the living room. Her face paled the moment she saw it. What is that?" she stammered. "You tell me," I said, my voice cold. "Or better yet, why don't you tell me about the storage unit?" Her mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. "I don't know what you're talking about. Don't lie to me." My voice cracked like a whip, and she flinched. "I know everything, Amalia. The cabin. The money. The gun. What were you planning? To take me out and ride off into the sunset with James?" Her silence was deafening. "You disgust me," I said finally, my voice trembling. "But you've underestimated me. This isn't over, Amalia. Not by a long shot." For the first time, fear flashed across her face. And it was the most satisfying thing I'd seen in weeks. Amalia didn't sleep that night. Neither did I. She sat curled on the edge of the couch, her knees pulled to her chest, her eyes darting toward the gun on the coffee table as if it might come to life. I stayed in the armchair, whiskey in hand, watching her. My mind was a storm of questions, suspicions, and half-formed plans. The woman I had built my life around, the woman I had loved unconditionally, was a stranger to me now. "I didn't plan this," she said at last, her voice breaking the silence like a shard of glass. "Not like you think." I didn't respond. Let her stew. Let her feel the weight of her betrayal. I made a mistake." Her voice trembled. "It got out of hand. James, he convinced me." "Don't," I snapped, my voice sharper than I intended. "Don't blame him. You chose this." Her tears came then, slow and quiet. Once, they would have melted my heart. Now, they felt like another manipulation. When I returned home, the house was eerily quiet. Amalia was in the kitchen, staring out the window. She didn't turn when I entered. "Are you going to tell me the truth?" I asked, my voice cold. She flinched but didn't reply. "Fine," I said, stepping closer. "Let me make it simple for you. Either you tell me everything right now, or I'll make sure James takes the fall for all of it. The money. The gun. All of it." Her head snapped around, her eyes wide with panic. "You wouldn't. Try me." And then, like a dam breaking, the truth came pouring out. "It started months ago," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't mean for it to go this far. James, he said we could have a future together. That we could take the money and disappear. But then he started talking about you. About how we needed to get rid of me," I finished for her. She nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I swear, David, I never wanted that. I told him it was insane, but he wouldn't listen. He said it was the only way." The room spun around me. My best friend had not only betrayed me but plotted to kill me, and Amalia had let it happen. That night, I sat alone in the study, staring at the gun from the storage unit. Every instinct screamed at me to go to the police, to end this nightmare. But something held me back. Revenge. If I went to the authorities, James and Amalia would face justice, but it would be impersonal, clinical. I wanted them to feel what I felt. The pain. The betrayal. The rage. I spent hours crafting a plan, every detail etched into my mind like a blueprint. Over the next few days, I played my part perfectly. I acted distant but calm, giving Amalia the illusion that I was willing to move past everything. I even suggested we take a weekend trip to the cabin, one last attempt to salvage our marriage. She hesitated, but the fear of losing me completely seemed to outweigh her guilt. She agreed. Meanwhile, I reached out to James. "We need to talk," I said over the phone, my voice measured. "Amalia's told me everything." There was a long pause before he replied. "Everything?" "Yes," I said, forcing a bitter laugh. "You win, James. She's yours. Let's settle this like men." He took the bait. The cabin was secluded, surrounded by dense forest. It was the perfect place for what I had in mind. Amalia and I arrived first. She seemed on edge, her movements stiff and uncertain. "Are you sure about this?" she asked as we unpacked. "Positive," I said, forcing a smile. When James arrived, the tension in the air was palpable. He tried to mask it with his usual charm, but his eyes darted nervously between Amalia and me. "Glad you could make it," I said, handing him a beer. "Let's talk." We sat around the fire pit as night fell, the flames casting flickering shadows on their faces. I let them think they had the upper hand, that I was broken and defeated. And then I struck. "I know everything," I said, my voice cutting through the crackling of the fire. "The money. The gun. The plan to kill me." Amalia gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. James froze, his beer halfway to his lips. "David, Amalia began, but I cut her off. "Save it," I snapped. "This ends tonight." James stood, his face hardening. "What are you going to do, David? Call the cops? You've got no proof." I smirked, pulling a small recorder from my pocket. "Funny you should say that. You're right, until now." Their faces went pale as I pressed play, the recording of their hushed conversation echoing through the still night air. "I hope you two enjoyed your little fantasy," I said, standing. "Because it's over." James's face twisted with rage as the recording played on. His confident facade cracked, revealing the predator beneath. He lunged forward, his hand swiping for the recorder, but I stepped back, holding it just out of reach. "Sit down," I said, my voice low and menacing. Amalia, pale and trembling, looked between us like a trapped animal. "David, please," she whispered. "This isn't what you think." I turned my glare on her, my patience evaporating. "What I think? You plotted to ruin me, Amalia. You and him. You made your choices. Now, live with them." James straightened, brushing imaginary dust off his sleeves. His composure was returning, but I could see the calculation in his eyes. "All right," he said smoothly, raising his hands in mock surrender. "You've made your point. What do you want, David? An apology? A check to buy your silence?" His arrogance ignited a fresh wave of fury. "What I want," I said, leaning forward, "is for you to suffer." The silence that followed was suffocating. The fire crackled between us, the only sound as I let my words sink in. "You think you've won," James said finally, a sneer curling his lips. "But you're out of your league." "Am I?" I asked, my tone calm but cold. "Because from where I'm standing, you're the one with everything to lose." I glanced at Amalia, her face a mask of guilt and fear. "And you? You're just as guilty. But lucky for you, I'm not going to the police, yet." Her eyes widened, a flicker of hope crossing her face. "No," I continued, savoring the way her relief crumbled. "You're going to help me. Both of you. Or this recording, and everything else I've uncovered, goes straight to the authorities." James laughed, a hollow sound that grated against my nerves. "You're bluffing. Without a word, I pulled a second recorder from my pocket. This one contained conversations between James and Amalia discussing the financial schemes, complete with dates and amounts. Still think I'm bluffing? James's laughter died, replaced by a cold fury. I'll make you a deal, I said, lowering my voice. You confess everything to me, every detail, every secret you've kept. I want the truth, all of it. In exchange, I might let you walk away without legal repercussions. Amalia's lips quivered. You'd really do that? Let us go? I met her gaze, my expression unreadable. Depends on how cooperative you are. For the first time, James looked genuinely unsure. His bravado faltered as he realized the gravity of the situation. All right, he said grudgingly. But we're not doing this out here. Fine, I said, pocketing the recorders. Inside. Now. The three of us sat around the small dining table in the cabin, the weight of the moment pressing down on us like a storm cloud. James leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, while Amalia sat with her hands clasped tightly in her lap. It started as a mistake, she said, her voice barely audible. A stupid mistake. James rolled his eyes. Don't sugarcoat it, Amalia. You wanted out of your boring little life, and I offered you an escape. Shut up, I snapped, glaring at him. Let her talk. Amalia's eyes filled with tears, but she continued. I thought it was just an affair. A way to feel alive again. But James had bigger plans. He said we could have everything, your money, your business. He made it sound so easy. And the gun? I asked, my voice cold. That wasn't me, Amalia said quickly, her voice trembling. That was all him. James smirked. It's called leverage, David. I was never going to use it. It was just insurance. Insurance against what? He leaned forward, his eyes gleaming. Against you figuring things out before we were ready. My fists clenched, but I forced myself to stay calm. So what was the plan, exactly? Steal everything and run? More or less, James said with a shrug. But I think we underestimated you. The tension in the room was suffocating. Every instinct screamed at me to end it, to call the police and let them deal with this mess. But something deeper held me back, a need for justice on my terms. You've ruined everything, I said quietly, my voice trembling with suppressed rage. Our friendship. My marriage. My life. For the first time, James looked uneasy. David, come on. Save it, I snapped. You're going to pay for this. Both of you. I stood, the chair scraping loudly against the floor. Here's how this works, I'll give you 1 week to set things right. Transfer back the money. Destroy any documents with my name on them. And you, I pointed at Amalia, my voice hardening. You're moving out. Her eyes widened in shock. David, please. Don't, I said, my voice breaking. You don't get to plead. Not anymore. The drive back from the cabin was silent. Amalia sat beside me, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her face a mask of misery. When we reached the house, she didn't even try to argue. She packed a small bag and left without a word. I didn't watch her go. That night, I sat alone in the living room, staring at the empty space where the woman I once loved had sat. The weight of everything crashed down on me, suffocating and relentless. But the game wasn't over yet. James and Amalia thought they'd gotten away with it. That I'd let them go. They had no idea what was coming next. The house felt emptier than ever after Amalia left. Her absence should have been a relief, but it was a haunting reminder of how thoroughly my life had been upended. Every room echoed with memories I could no longer cherish, every corner held whispers of a love that was now a lie. I didn't allow myself to grieve. Not yet. There was work to be done. James and Amalia thought they'd bought themselves time, that I would quietly fade into the background while they figured out their next move. But they didn't understand me. They didn't know the lengths I was willing to go to. And they were about to find out. I spent the next 2 days combing through every scrap of evidence Johnny Walker had gathered. Bank statements, emails, surveillance photos, they painted a damning picture. But what stood out most were the forged financial documents bearing my name. James had been sloppy, leaving digital breadcrumbs everywhere. Transactions routed through his company accounts, messages discussing the diversion of funds, all of it was meticulously documented. It was time to put that evidence to use. First, I called our mutual acquaintances in the business world. James had built his reputation on charm and persuasion, but I had the receipts to expose the rot beneath the surface. A carefully worded tip here, a strategic leak there. Within hours, whispers began circulating about James's shady dealings. By the end of the week, his company's biggest clients were reconsidering their contracts. Amalia wasn't spared either. I knew her new job was everything to her, a fresh start, free from the financial pressure I'd carried for us for years. But the affair wasn't her only secret. Johnny's file included evidence of smaller, petty thefts, expenses she'd fudged at her previous job, bills she'd claimed as work-related but clearly weren't. Nothing major, but enough to raise questions. I sent an anonymous email to her employer, attaching a few choice pieces of evidence. Within days, Amalia was called into a meeting with HR. She didn't know it yet, but her days at the company were numbered. James called me late one evening, his voice tight with barely restrained anger. "What the hell are you doing, David?" "Evening, James," I said calmly. "Something wrong?" "You know damn well what's wrong. My clients are pulling out, my reputation's in the toilet. You're sabotaging me." I leaned back in my chair, savoring the fury in his voice. "Sabotaging you? No, James. I'm just leveling the playing field. You wanted to ruin my life. I'm simply returning the favor." There was a pause, and when he spoke again, his tone was venomous. "You think you've won, don't you? But this isn't over. Not by a long shot." "You're right," I said, my voice ice cold. "It's just getting started." The next phase of my plan required precision. I knew James and Amalia would start looking for ways to retaliate, desperate people always do. I had to stay ahead of them, to anticipate their every move. I contacted Johnny Walker again, instructing him to keep tabs on both of them. "Don't let them know they're being watched," I said. "I want to know everything they're up to." It didn't take long for Johnny to uncover their next play. "They're meeting at a hotel downtown," he told me one afternoon. "It looks like they're planning something big." "What kind of big?" He hesitated. "They've been talking about transferring the remaining funds. Offshore accounts. Once that's done, they'll be untouchable." I clenched my fists, the weight of their betrayal crashing down on me all over again. But this time, I was ready. I let them think they were safe, that their plan was going off without a hitch. Meanwhile, I worked quietly behind the scenes. I reached out to a friend in law enforcement, a detective I'd helped with a marketing campaign years ago. "I've got a situation," I told him, carefully laying out the details. "I need your help." He didn't ask too many questions. By the end of the call, he'd agreed to monitor the transfer and flag it as fraudulent. The day of their big meeting arrived, and I was waiting in the hotel parking lot, watching as James and Amalia entered the building. They looked so confident, so sure of themselves. I followed them at a distance, keeping to the shadows. When they reached the private conference room they'd rented, I slipped in just before the door closed. The look on their faces when they saw me was worth every sleepless night. "Surprised to see me?" I asked, closing the door behind me. Amelia's face went pale, and James's jaw tightened. "David, you don't want to do this," he said. "Oh, but I do," I replied, my voice calm and steady. "I want to watch you squirm." I placed my phone on the table, hitting play on the audio recordings Johnny had collected. Their voices filled the room, discussing the stolen money, the fake accounts, the lies they'd told. "You were so careful," I said mockingly. "But not careful enough." James lunged for the phone, but I was faster. I grabbed it and stepped back, glaring at him. "It's over," I said. "The transfers? Blocked. The accounts? Frozen. And as for your reputations? Let's just say you'll be lucky if either of you ever works again." I left them there, stunned and speechless, their perfect little scheme crumbling around them. It was the most satisfying moment of my life. But I wasn't done yet. There was still one more move to make, one final nail in their coffin. As I walked away from the hotel, a smile crossed my lips. The best was yet to come. James and Amalia were scrambling now, their lives unraveling faster than they could control. I watched it all unfold from a distance, each new revelation about their plight bringing a grim sense of satisfaction. Their clients were gone, their accounts frozen, and their reputations in tatters. James had always fancied himself a master manipulator, but he was now nothing more than a desperate man clinging to the last threads of his crumbling life. Amalia wasn't faring much better. Rumors of her misconduct had spread through her industry like wildfire. She'd been terminated, and her once carefully curated image of professionalism was in ruins. Still, they hadn't given up. Not yet. I could see it in the way they moved, in the whispered meetings Johnny Walker continued to track. They were cornered animals now, and cornered animals were dangerous. It was time to end this. The idea came to me late one night as I stared at the ceiling, sleep eluding me yet again. They had taken everything from me, my marriage, my friendship, my peace of mind. If I truly wanted to close this chapter, I needed to strip them of everything, to ensure they had nothing left to rebuild with. The first step was to use their own weapons against them. I had the recordings, the documents, the trail of evidence they had so carelessly left behind. But I needed to make sure the fallout was public and irreversible. I reached out to a journalist I knew, a sharp, relentless investigator who thrived on uncovering scandals. We met in a quiet diner on the outskirts of town, where I handed over a meticulously organized dossier of everything I'd gathered. "This is explosive," she said, flipping through the pages. "That's the point," I replied. "I want everyone to know who they really are." She promised to run the story within the week. When the article went live, it was like a bomb had gone off. The headline alone was enough to capture attention: local power couple exposed, a web of lies, fraud, and betrayal. The piece detailed everything: James's embezzlement, Amelia's complicity, their affair, and their failed scheme to destroy me. It included damning quotes from the recordings, photos from Johnny's surveillance, and expert analysis of the financial records. The response was immediate and brutal. Social media exploded with outrage, and within hours, James and Amalia became pariahs. Former friends and colleagues distanced themselves publicly, eager to avoid the fallout. By the end of the day, James's company had announced his termination, and Amelia's name was being dragged through every professional network she'd once held sway over. James was the first to confront me. He showed up at my office unannounced, his usually sharp suit rumpled, his face etched with desperation. "You think this is over?" he snarled as he stormed into my office. I stood, meeting his glare with cold detachment. "It is over, James. You just don't realize it yet. You ruined me," he hissed, his hands balling into fists. "No," I corrected. "You ruined yourself. I just made sure everyone saw it." For a moment, I thought he might hit me. His whole body trembled with barely restrained fury. But then he seemed to deflate, the fight draining out of him. Without another word, he turned and walked out. Amalia came later, slipping through the back entrance to avoid being seen. She looked like a ghost of the woman I'd once loved, her hair unkempt, her eyes hollow. "David," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Please. I'm sorry. I was stupid. I didn't know what I was doing." Her words fell on deaf ears. "You knew exactly what you were doing," I said coldly. "You just didn't think you'd get caught." She sank into a chair, tears streaming down her face. "Can't we fix this? Please. I'll do whatever it takes." I laughed bitterly. "Fix this? You plotted to destroy me, Amalia. There's nothing left to fix." She looked up at me, a glimmer of hope in her eyes. "But I still love you." "Don't," I interrupted, my voice sharp. "You don't get to say that. Not anymore." By the end of the month, James had filed for bankruptcy, his assets seized to cover the debts his schemes had incurred. He disappeared from the public eye, retreating into obscurity. Amalia moved back in with her parents, her career in shambles. I heard whispers that she was seeking therapy, trying to rebuild her life. I felt no satisfaction in her suffering, only a hollow emptiness. As for me, I sold the house. It was too full of memories I didn't want to keep. I found a small apartment on the edge of the city, where I could start over. One night, as I sat on the balcony overlooking the city lights, I allowed myself to feel the weight of everything that had happened. The revenge had been satisfying in its own way, but it hadn't brought me peace. I had won the battle, but at what cost? The answer wasn't clear yet. But for the first time in months, I felt a flicker of hope, a small, fragile spark that maybe, just maybe, I could rebuild something worth living for. Weeks passed, and the chaos faded into a distant echo. James and Amalia had been thoroughly dismantled, their lives reduced to the rubble they had planned for mine. But as the dust settled, a strange sense of emptiness crept in. I had won, but victory felt hollow. The betrayal, the plotting, the revenge, it had consumed me, leaving behind a shell of the man I used to be. The nights were the worst, the silence deafening. It was time to rebuild. I began by clearing out the remnants of my old life. The apartment was a blank slate, no photos, no mementos, no ghosts of the past to haunt me. I kept the decor simple, a sleek couch, a modest dining table, and a single framed print of a mountain range. Every morning, I forced myself into a routine. A run through the park. A cup of coffee at the local cafe. Work at my new firm. I had left my old company behind, too many memories tying me to Alan and the life I wanted to forget. Starting fresh professionally felt like the right step. Slowly, the days began to feel lighter. One crisp autumn evening, I found myself wandering into a bookstore on a whim. The warm light and faint smell of paper were oddly comforting. As I browsed the shelves, a voice broke through my thoughts. "Looking for anything specific?" I turned to see a woman standing nearby, her smile friendly but not intrusive. She was dressed casually, a knit sweater draped over jeans, her hair tucked into a messy bun. "Just something to get lost in," I replied, surprised by how natural the words felt. Her smile widened. "Try this." She handed me a novel, the cover depicting a stormy seascape. "It's a little heavy, but worth it." I took the book, our fingers brushing briefly. "Thanks. I'll give it a shot." She nodded, turning to walk away, but something made me call out. "What's your name?" "Lena," she said, glancing over her shoulder. "David," I replied. "Nice to meet you, David." And just like that, a spark lit in the darkness. Lena and I crossed paths again a week later at the same bookstore. This time, she was sitting by the window, a cup of tea steaming beside her as she flipped through a magazine. I hesitated, then approached. "Mind if I join you?" She looked up, surprised but pleased. Not at all. We talked for hours, the conversation flowing effortlessly. She was a photographer, her work focused on capturing overlooked beauty in everyday life. There was an openness about her, a quiet strength that drew me in. I didn't tell her about my past, not yet. But for the first time in months, I felt a glimmer of something I hadn't thought possible: hope. Just as I began to find my footing, the past came knocking. It started with a letter, hand-delivered to my apartment. The envelope bore no return address, but the handwriting was unmistakable: Amalia's. I hesitated before opening it, my chest tightening as I unfolded the paper. The letter was short, almost desperate. David. I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I need to say this. I'm sorry. For everything. I've lost everything because of my choices, and I know I have no one to blame but myself. I just needed you to know that I loved you once. Truly. I hope you can find happiness again. Amalia. I crumpled the letter and tossed it aside. Her words felt empty, too little too late. But that night, her voice echoed in my dreams, stirring memories I'd tried to bury. The next morning, I resolved not to let her pull me back into the darkness. Just as I began to find my footing, the past came knocking. It started with a letter, hand-delivered to my apartment. The envelope bore no return address, but the handwriting was unmistakable: Amalia's. I hesitated before opening it, my chest tightening as I unfolded the paper. The letter was short, almost desperate. David. I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I need to say this. I'm sorry. For everything. I've lost everything because of my choices, and I know I have no one to blame but myself. I just needed you to know that I loved you once. Truly. I hope you can find happiness again. Amalia. I crumpled the letter and tossed it aside. Her words felt empty, too little too late. But that night, her voice echoed in my dreams, stirring memories I'd tried to bury. The next morning, I resolved not to let her pull me back into the darkness. Lena and I continued to see each other, our bond growing stronger with each passing week. She never pried into my past, content to let me share pieces of it on my own terms. When I finally told her about Amalia and James, her reaction surprised me. That must have been devastating, she said softly, her hand covering mine. But you're here now. That says a lot about your strength. I looked into her eyes, searching for judgment or pity, but found only understanding. It's not easy, I admitted. There are days when it feels like the weight of it all might crush me. She smiled gently. Then let me help carry some of it. Months later, I ran into Amalia by chance. I was walking through the park with Lena when I spotted her sitting on a bench, staring at the ground. She looked up as we approached, her face a mixture of shock and sorrow. David, she said, her voice barely audible. Lena glanced at me, sensing the tension. I'll give you a minute, she said, squeezing my hand before stepping away. Amalia stood, her movements hesitant. You look good, she said, her gaze flickering to Lena in the distance. I am good, I replied, my tone steady. I wanted to say thank you, she stammered. For letting me walk away. I studied her, searching for the anger or pain I'd expected to feel, but found nothing. I didn't do it for you, Amalia. I did it for me. She nodded, her eyes glistening. I'm glad you're happy. As she walked away, I turned back to Lena, who was waiting with a knowing smile. Everything okay? She asked. Yeah, I said, taking her hand. It is now. The road to healing wasn't easy, but with Lena by my side, I began to see the light at the end of the tunnel. My past would always be a part of me, but it no longer defined me. I had survived betrayal, endured heartbreak, and found strength in the wreckage. And now, I was ready to live again. The weeks turned into months, and for the first time in years, my life began to feel stable. Lena was a grounding force, her presence a steady beacon in the chaos that had once consumed me. We'd fallen into a comfortable rhythm, mornings spent sipping coffee on her balcony, afternoons filled with work, and evenings lost in quiet conversations or aimless drives. With her, there were no pretenses, no masks. But even in the calm, there were echoes of the storm. One rainy afternoon, there was a knock at my door. I wasn't expecting anyone, and when I opened it, I was greeted by a man I didn't recognize, tall, with sharp features and an air of authority. "David?" he asked. I nodded warily. "Who's asking?" "My name is Detective Harris. I'm investigating some recent allegations involving James Caldwell and Amalia." I froze, the mention of their names tightening my chest. "What about them?" He held up a folder. "We have reason to believe their financial activities extend far beyond what's been made public. Offshore accounts, fraudulent investments, it's a tangled web, and we think you might have some information that could help." I stepped aside, letting him in. As we sat in the living room, Harris explained the situation in detail. The fallout from the article I'd orchestrated had led to deeper scrutiny of James and Amalia's dealings. "I thought it was over," I said, my voice tinged with exhaustion. "With people like them, it's rarely over," Harris replied. "But if you're willing to share what you know, we can make sure they face real consequences this time." That night, I stared at the folder Harris had left behind. Inside were documents, timelines, and photos, all evidence of the continued investigation into James and Amalia. I thought about everything they'd done to me, the pain they'd caused. But I also thought about the cost of dragging myself back into their orbit. Was it worth reopening old wounds to see justice served? Lena found me sitting on the couch, the folder unopened in my lap. "You look like you've seen a ghost," she said, sitting beside me. "Something like that," I admitted, explaining the detective's visit. She listened quietly, her expression unreadable. When I finished, she placed her hand on mine. "You've already given them too much of your life, David. Don't let them take any more." Her words echoed in my mind long after she went to bed. The next morning, I called Detective Harris. "I'll help," I said simply. The decision wasn't easy, but I couldn't shake the feeling that walking away entirely would leave the door open for James and Amalia to hurt someone else. If I could stop that, I had to try. Over the next few weeks, I met with Harris regularly, providing every piece of evidence I had. The recordings, the financial documents, even Johnny Walker's surveillance reports, it all became part of the growing case against them. It was exhausting, reliving the betrayal again and again, but with each new revelation, I felt a sense of closure creeping in. One morning, as I scrolled through the news on my phone, a headline caught my eye: "Former business executive and associate arrested in major fraud scandal." The article detailed the culmination of Harris's investigation. James had been arrested at his office, handcuffed in front of his remaining employees. Amalia had been taken into custody at her parents' house, her tearful protests falling on deaf ears. It was done. I set the phone down, staring out the window. I didn't feel joy or satisfaction, just relief. A few weeks later, I received a letter from Amalia. Unlike the first, this one wasn't an apology, it was a plea. "David, I know I've done terrible things, and I don't deserve your forgiveness. But I need your help. They're saying I'll go to prison, that I'll lose everything. Please, if there's any part of you that remembers the love we once shared, help me. I'm begging you. Amalia." I crumpled the letter without hesitation. Whatever love I'd once had for her was gone, burned away by her choices. This time, I didn't lose sleep. Lena and I took a trip to the mountains that weekend, escaping the city and the memories it held. The air was crisp, the landscape a patchwork of autumn colors. As we hiked along a winding trail, she stopped and turned to me, her eyes searching mine. "You're different," she said softly. "How so?" "Lighter," she said, smiling. "Like you've finally let go of something." I thought about her words as we continued walking. She was right. For the first time in what felt like forever, the weight of my past no longer pressed on my shoulders. I wasn't the man I'd been before James and Amelia's betrayal, but I wasn't their victim anymore either. That night, under a blanket of stars, I looked at Lena and felt something I hadn't thought possible: peace. The road to redemption had been long and painful, but I'd made it. And for the first time, I could see a future worth fighting for. The mountain air was crisp and clear, carrying with it a sense of renewal. Lena and I sat on a weathered bench overlooking the valley, the sun dipping below the horizon in a blaze of amber and gold. It had been months since I'd last thought of James or Amalia, and the peace I'd found was no longer fleeting. It was steady, like the heartbeat of the mountains surrounding us. "What are you thinking?" Lena asked, her voice soft but curious. I smiled, my gaze fixed on the horizon. "That I'm lucky. And that I never thought I'd feel this way again." She reached for my hand, her touch grounding me. "You deserve this, David. You fought for it." The following week, life continued its steady rhythm. Work was fulfilling, friendships were being rebuilt, and my relationship with Lena grew deeper by the day. But just as I thought I'd closed the chapter on my past, an unexpected phone call threatened to pull me back. "David," Detective Harris's voice crackled through the line, "I thought you'd want to know. James took a plea deal. Amelia's going to trial." I gripped the phone tightly. "And what does that mean for me?" "It means they might try to bring you into it," Harris said. "Amelia's team is desperate. They're throwing everything they can at the wall to see what sticks. I just wanted to give you a heads up." I thanked him and hung up, my mood darkening. After everything, it seemed Amalia wasn't done trying to drag me down with her. Lena noticed my tension immediately when I got home. "What's wrong?" she asked, concern etched across her face. I hesitated, unsure if I wanted to burden her with this latest development. But Lena had always been my anchor, and I couldn't shut her out. "Amelia's trial is coming up," I admitted. "There's a chance I might get pulled into it." Her expression softened, and she stepped closer, wrapping her arms around me. "You've already faced worse than this, David. Whatever happens, we'll handle it together." Her words were a balm to my frayed nerves. A month later, the subpoena arrived. I was called as a witness in Amelia's defense, a last-ditch effort to paint her as a victim of James's manipulation. I wanted to refuse, but the law left me no choice. The day of the trial, I entered the courtroom with a knot in my stomach. Amalia was seated at the defense table, her once confident demeanor replaced by a hollow weariness. Her eyes flickered toward me, but I refused to meet her gaze. As I took the stand, her lawyer began his questioning, trying to paint a picture of Amalia as a desperate woman led astray by a manipulative partner. "Would you say your marriage was in trouble before James entered the picture?" the lawyer asked, his tone smooth and calculated. "Our marriage had problems, like any marriage," I said evenly. "But those problems didn't give her the right to betray me." Amelia's lawyer pressed on, but I held my ground. By the time I stepped down, I felt lighter, as if speaking the truth had freed me from the last vestiges of her hold over me. 2 weeks later, the verdict was announced: guilty. Amalia was sentenced to 3 years in prison for her role in the fraud, while James received a longer sentence for masterminding the scheme. When I read the news, I felt no triumph, no vindication, only relief. It was finally over. That evening, Lena and I sat on the couch, a fire crackling in the hearth. She handed me a glass of wine, her eyes searching mine. "How do you feel?" she asked gently. "Free," I said after a moment of reflection. "For the first time in a long time, I feel free." She smiled, leaning her head against my shoulder. Then let's make the most of it. Over the next year, I focused on building a life I could be proud of. Lena and I traveled, exploring hidden corners of the world and creating memories that felt like stitches mending an old wound. I reconnected with friends I'd distanced myself from during the chaos, rebuilding bridges that I thought had been burned. My work flourished, and for the first time, I felt a sense of purpose that wasn't tied to anyone else's expectations. Amelia's name became a faint echo in my mind, a ghost from a life I no longer recognized. On a quiet summer evening, Lena and I sat on the porch of a cabin we'd rented for the weekend. The sky was painted with stars, the air warm and fragrant. She looked at me, her eyes filled with a mix of affection and mischief. "You know," she said, "this might be the happiest I've ever seen you." I reached for her hand, my heart swelling with gratitude. "That's because I've finally learned what it means to let go." And for the first time, I truly believed it. Lena and I stood on the balcony of our new home, the city lights twinkling in the distance. It had been 2 years since Amelia's trial, and life felt like it had finally fallen into place. I had rebuilt everything they had tried to destroy, my career, my friendships, my peace of mind. And I had Lena. Her love had been my anchor, her unwavering belief in me a beacon during my darkest moments. "Here's to new beginnings," I said, raising my glass of wine. "To leaving the past behind," she replied, her smile lighting up the night. We clinked glasses, the soft chime echoing in the stillness. But just as I thought I had truly left the past behind, it came roaring back in a way I could never have imagined. It began with a phone call. An unfamiliar number. Normally, I wouldn't have answered, but something compelled me to pick up. "David," a man's voice said, cold and deliberate. "We need to talk." "Who is this?" I asked, my brow furrowing. "You don't know me, but I know you. My name is Eric Caldwell. I'm James's brother." The name hit me like a punch to the gut. "What do you want?" "Answers," he said simply. "About why my brother's life fell apart. And what role you played in it." "I don't owe you anything," I said, my voice hard. "No?" His tone sharpened. "Because I think you do. And I think you'd want to hear what I have to say." Before I could respond, the line went dead. I debated ignoring him, but curiosity, and a gnawing sense of unease, got the better of me. 2 days later, I met Eric at a cafe downtown. He was tall and imposing, with sharp features that bore an uncanny resemblance to James. But where James had exuded charm, Eric's demeanor was ice-cold, his eyes piercing. "Why am I here?" I asked as I sat down. Eric leaned forward, his hands clasped on the table. "I wanted to meet the man who destroyed my brother." "Your brother destroyed himself," I shot back. "He betrayed me, stole from me, and tried to ruin my life. And you made sure he paid for it. I can respect that." His lips twisted into a thin smile. "But here's the thing, David, you didn't just destroy James. You ruined my family. My parents can't even look at each other. Our name is dirt. And for what? So you could get your revenge?" I felt a flicker of guilt, but I quickly shoved it aside. "Your brother deserved everything he got." "Maybe," Eric said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "But Amalia didn't." The words sent a chill down my spine. "What are you talking about?" "She's dead," he said bluntly. "Killed herself 6 months ago. Left a note. You broke her." I froze, my mind reeling. "She begged you for forgiveness, didn't she?" Eric continued, his tone cutting. "And you threw it back in her face." I wanted to argue, to deny it, but the memory of her letter, the one I'd crumpled and thrown away, rose unbidden in my mind. "This is on you, David," Eric said, standing abruptly. "And I'm going to make sure you feel what it's like to lose everything." Before I could respond, he turned and walked out, leaving me alone with the weight of his words. Over the next few weeks, I couldn't shake Eric's accusations. The image of Amalia's face, pale and tear-streaked, haunted my dreams. Her voice echoed in my mind, pleading for a second chance. Lena noticed the change in me immediately. "You've been distant," she said one evening, her eyes filled with concern. "What's going on?" I wanted to tell her, but the words stuck in my throat. How could I explain that the ghost of my past had returned to torment me? "It's nothing," I lied. But it wasn't nothing. Eric wasn't finished with me. It started with phone calls in the middle of the night, brief, taunting messages that left my nerves frayed. "Enjoying your perfect little life," his voice would sneer before the line went dead. Then came the letters. Photographs of Lena and me, taken from a distance. Notes scrawled in bold, angry handwriting: "You took my family. Now I'll take yours." I went to the police, but there was little they could do without solid evidence. "You're overreacting," Lena said when I told her about Eric. "He's just trying to scare you." But deep down, I knew it was more than that. One night, I came home to find the apartment dark and silent. "Lena?" I called, my voice echoing in the stillness. There was no answer. I searched every room, panic rising with each empty space. And then I saw it, a note on the kitchen counter, scrawled in the same bold handwriting as the letters. "She's gone, David. Just like you took Amalia. Now you'll know how it feels." My heart stopped. I called Lena's phone, but it went straight to voicemail. Desperation clawed at my chest as I dialed the police, my mind racing with worst-case scenarios. Hours later, they found her, shaken but unharmed, at a motel on the edge of town. She'd been drugged and left there, a cruel echo of the torment Eric believed I'd inflicted on his family. As I held her in my arms, relief flooding through me, I realized something chilling: Eric wasn't going to stop. Not until one of us was destroyed. That night, I made a decision. I wouldn't let Eric dictate my life. I wouldn't let him take anything else from me. But to end this, I'd have to confront him on his terms. And I knew, deep down, that there was no guarantee I'd come out unscathed.